True freedom does not shine. It is not beautiful or comfortable. It does not make you smile or go viral in 15-second videos. True freedom is silent, invisible, and almost no one wants to touch it. Because it comes at a price that most are not willing to pay. Facing the void. You only discover if you are free when there is nothing to do, no one to please, and no notifications to react to. When the world goes silent and you remain whole, that's when the test begins. A simple but brutal test, being able to get bored. If this topic makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. Nietzsche realized this before the internet, before algorithms, before our modern addiction to constant stimulation. He understood that modern man is afraid of himself, and that because of this, he flees from silence as one flees from the abyss. But the abyss is within. It always has been. Boredom is the frontier where external control ends and internal chaos begins. And that's where many retreat. They prefer programmed comfort to the uncertainty of looking inward, because facing boredom is like being left in a white room with mirrors on all sides. Nothing to do, no one to impress, just you and yourself. Society calls this lost time, but Nietzsche would call it time regained, pure, raw, essential time. Time when the soul can hear itself, and perhaps scream. The greatest prison of the 21st century is not being able to spend an hour in absolute silence. No cell phone, no music, nothing. Just you. If that terrifies you, then maybe you've never been free. You've just lived busy. Freedom is not a lifestyle. It is a test of endurance. And that test begins when the world stops and you keep going. Nietzsche said, "And if a demon should sneak up to you in your loneliest solitude and say, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you must live once more and countless times more.'" This is the idea of eternal return. And it is not about reincarnation, but about confronting the value of every moment lived. Now imagine that the moment that repeats itself forever is boredom. No distractions, no achievements, no praise. Just the moment, unadorned. Could you bear it? Or would you despair? Emptiness is not an accident. It returns. And the more you avoid it, the more it imposes itself, because everything you compulsively avoid controls you. Nietzsche knew this. He saw boredom not as an evil, but as an opportunity. An existential test that reveals the degree of your inner autonomy. Modern man lives programmed to flee from nothingness. Nothing to do has become synonymous with failure, but this nothingness is where truth begins to emerge, because in silence you perceive the noise that was drowning you out. And this noise does not come from outside, it comes from within. When the eternal return of boredom appears, it does not come to torture you, it comes to remind you that you are still alive, that there is something in you that resists even without stimulus, something that observes, feels, thinks, even when everything has stopped. It is this something that Nietzsche wanted to strengthen. A kind of strength that does not depend on likes, goals, or rewards. The strength to be whole within your own emptiness. Because if you need constant stimulation to exist, then you are not alive on your own. You are just being kept in motion by external devices. The return of boredom is the return of yourself. The problem is that many no longer recognize their own presence. We live in an age where pleasure has become protocol. Every second something shines, vibrates, or calls us with promises of novelty. The rule is clear: whoever stops loses, whoever slows down disappears. But all this urgency is not natural, it is induced. We are surrounded by an invisible dictatorship, that of constant stimulation. Each notification is a micro-injection of dopamine. Each scroll is a dose of escape, and the most dangerous thing, the feeling that this is normal. Nietzsche, if he were alive today, probably wouldn't have social media, not out of arrogance but out of self-defense, because he knew that deep thinking is born in silence, and that excessive stimulation turns the mind into a field of noise. The dictatorship of stimulation does not shout, it whispers. It convinces you that you are informed when in fact you are distracted. It makes you confuse movement with progress, and noise with life. And the result? An army of fragmented minds, unable to go 3 minutes without picking up their cell phones. People who confuse agitation with freedom, but who are trapped in a routine of constant escape. This escape comes at a price: the inability to deal with boredom. Because if all you know is stimulation, silence becomes a threat. And that's when you realize how conditioned you are. Nietzsche proposed another path, a path of confrontation, of disconnecting everything, of bearing the weight of one's own consciousness without digital analgesia. He knew that boredom is not an enemy. It is the gateway to something deeper. But to access that portal, you need to break your dependence on stimulation. You need to have the courage to stop and stay stopped. Only then will you discover what is still alive in you when everything else is silent. As long as stimulation is your master, boredom will be your executioner. But when you master boredom, no stimulation has power over you anymore. Silence is not peace. Silence is hostile territory. No wonder many people can only sleep with noise in the background. The sound of the TV, headphones, the fan on full blast. Anything will do, as long as it drowns out what comes from within. Nietzsche understood silence as the moment when truth appears without asking permission. When the world is quiet, you hear the voices you've spent years muffling, and they don't come politely. They come as they are, raw, imperfect, uncomfortable. Silence is the zone of confrontation, the internal ring where old ideas, ancient fears, and buried desires meet. There is no audience. There is no audience. Just you, surrounded by everything you have avoided feeling. That's when boredom changes form. It ceases to be an absence of stimulation and becomes a true presence. And that's scary, because the truth cannot be edited. It has no filter. It appears like an avalanche that buries distractions. Most people run away. Press play, open your feed, call someone, anything. Because silence, when it is absolute, reveals what you really carry inside. And what many carry is guilt, emptiness, lies, and unfulfilled desires. Nietzsche saw this not as a curse, but as liberation, because only by confronting these voices can you discover who you are, not who they said you are, but what remains when everything collapses. That is why silence is essential. It is the first tool of the thinker, the creator, the rebel. Because those who master silence are not afraid of their own minds, and those who are not afraid of their own minds no longer need to run away. The problem has never been the noise of the world. It has been the fear of hearing what exists when it stops. Boredom is not a flaw in the system. It is a strategic resource of existence. Nietzsche would have said, "Those who cannot stand boredom do not deserve freedom," because boredom is training, a gym for the soul. And the exercise is simple. Endure yourself. Spending an hour in absolute silence without a cell phone, without distractions, is harder than running a marathon. Because the body may be still, but the mind starts screaming. It wants to escape. It wants an outlet. But at that moment, if you can hold on, something grows stronger. Your presence. That's when boredom becomes a philosophical tool. It reveals your true mental strength. When there is nothing to distract you, your true thoughts emerge. And they are not always pretty, but they are real. Nietzsche wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for clarity. And boredom is one of the shortest and hardest paths to achieve it. It pulls us out of autopilot. It forces us to face our thoughts without distraction. And those who face their raw, unadorned thoughts begin to think for themselves. This is rare, because thinking for yourself hurts. It takes effort, but it's also the only way to stop being manipulated. Because as long as you need stimulation to live, anyone can control you. All they have to do is offer you a distraction. The practice of boredom is not about producing. It's about remaining, staying present even when nothing is happening. And this, paradoxically, activates a clarity that excess stimulation suffocates. It is in the midst of boredom that the best thoughts arise. Not the quickest, but the deepest. And what is philosophy, if not the art of sustaining deep thoughts long enough for them to transform you? Nietzsche didn't want you to be productive. He wanted you to be strong. And the strength he preached does not come from speed, but from endurance. To resist boredom is to resist escape. And resisting escape is the first step toward any real transformation. We live under the illusion that freedom is having options. More choices, more power, more paths, more autonomy. But Nietzsche would dismantle that in seconds. Because for him, real freedom has nothing to do with what you can do, but with what you can endure. When you have 1,000 possibilities, but you need all of them to feel good, you are not free. You are hostage to choice, hostage to variety, hostage to movement. True freedom begins when you can stay where you are, even when there is absolutely nothing in your favor. Enduring boredom is enduring non-control. It is accepting that the world is not here to entertain you, and yet, not falling apart. This requires a rare kind of strength, the strength to be with yourself without seeking help from outside. Nietzsche would say that a free soul is one that can bear itself, that can bear the weight of its own presence, without addiction, without escape, without distraction. This is not passivity. It is mastery. The freedom that the market sells is a well-packaged illusion. It gives you choice but never autonomy, because the more options you have, the more dependent you become on the feeling of choosing. And that, deep down, is just another form of imprisonment. Now look at the opposite. Someone who doesn't need to choose anything to feel whole, who doesn't need to run to their cell phone when silence appears, who doesn't panic when faced with an empty hour. That person isn't free just because they can be. They're free because they can handle it. Nietzsche didn't want a life full of paths. He wanted a life that made sense even when no path presented itself. And for that, you need an unshakable inner foundation. The kind of foundation that can only be built in discomfort, in waiting, in boredom. It is in this scenario that true freedom is born, not from the quantity of stimuli but from their absence, not from the variety of choices, but from the strength to endure the present, raw, dry, difficult, without running away. There is a dangerous myth that great ideas are born in the heat of excitement, but the mind does not create better when it is euphoric. It creates better when it is empty. Boredom, which is treated as an enemy today, was once the cradle of some of the most powerful ideas in history. Nietzsche understood this perfectly, because he knew that original thinking does not spring from noise. It springs from the interval, from silence, from the space between one distraction and another, when there is finally an emptiness to be filled by something that comes from within. Euphoria is loud, it is fast, it is unstable. Boredom, on the other hand, is slow, heavy, and insistent. It digs deep. It forces the mind out of autopilot. It forces it to seek meaning where there is no stimulus, and in this process, true creativity begins to emerge, not as an explosion, but as a revelation. It is when there is nothing to consume that the brain begins to produce, because it needs to survive the void. It needs to generate meaning to endure the absence of stimulus, and that is where creative power lies. Nietzsche saw the thinker as a sculptor of his own consciousness, and boredom as the invisible chisel that forces you to look inside, dig up ideas, shape visions. The creativity that comes from this process is not meant to please. It is meant to confront. In a world where everything is made to be immediate, creators who can endure boredom have a brutal advantage. They can think without interference, create without validation, sustain an idea long enough for it to gain weight, not just volume. This is the creativity that transforms, because it does not come from the surface. It comes from the core, and only those who can endure the discomfort of boredom can get there. Nietzsche didn't want you to be creative for applause. He wanted you to create out of inner necessity, and that necessity only appears when the mind is not too busy to feel. Boredom is the cradle of originality, but only for those who can get through it without asking for anesthesia. It's curious. The more boredom tightens its grip, the more we run, as if it were a threat, as if something bad were about to happen. But what boredom reveals is not the problem. It's the symptom. It shows that we are addicted to stimulation, and that without it we feel empty. Nietzsche saw this movement as a sophisticated form of cowardice. We flee from boredom because it lays bare what we have inside. And for many this is unbearable, because when everything falls silent, what appears is not calm. It is the echo of what you avoided feeling. But that is exactly what you need most. The discomfort, the pause, the strangeness, because only through them can you leave the surface. Only through them can you truly know yourself. And knowing yourself hurts, yes, but it hurts cleanly. We flee from boredom as if fleeing from a mirror. We prefer to fill our time with anything. Social media, TV shows, useless tasks, all to avoid emptiness. But this emptiness is not absence. It is space. And space is where something new can happen. Nietzsche said that human beings need chaos within themselves to give birth to a dancing star. Boredom is this silent chaos. It is what initiates the process of breaking with false order. It is what opens the door for something authentic to emerge. But modern culture pathologizes boredom, as if it were a mistake to be corrected with immediate stimulation. Are you bored? Pick up your phone, watch something, buy something. The problem is that this solves boredom, but it takes you away from yourself. What we need most is not more content. It is more space. Space to reflect, to feel, to collapse and rebuild. And boredom is the beginning of that reconstruction. But it takes courage, because those who face boredom head-on discover that what seemed empty was just waiting to be inhabited. Solitude, for Nietzsche, was not a punishment. It was a noble condition, a space where the spirit can hear itself clearly. And boredom, as uncomfortable as it may seem, is only the initial stage of true solitude, the kind that depends on no one and nothing. Being alone is an art, and like all art, it requires practice. At first it seems strange, then it starts to make sense, and finally it becomes a necessity. Because only in solitude do you realize how much of what you called I was just collective noise. Nietzsche did not advocate social isolation. He advocated building an individuality strong enough not to dissolve into the crowd. And the first test of this strength is, can you be alone without feeling abandoned? Boredom appears at this exact point, when the company of others leaves, and only yours remains. If you have never practiced this, the impact is immediate. Anxiety sets in, insecurity screams, the mind demands distraction. But if you hold on, something changes. You start to listen to yourself, not to the voices you want to hear, but to those that have been silent for years. And some are brutal. They show you how far you have strayed from yourself. Others are powerful. They reveal directions you never dared to consider. This is the pleasure of being alone that Nietzsche envisioned. Not the pleasure of calm, but the pleasure of integrity, of being one with yourself without needing an audience. Because those who learn to be alone are never really alone, they are complete. Most people fear boredom because they fear loneliness. But loneliness is where you stop acting, where you look at yourself without performance, without expectation, without editing. It is where you find yourself, or deconstruct yourself entirely to finally rebuild yourself. Nietzsche knew, only those who have learned to live outside of men can live among them. And this outside begins in silence, in boredom, in empty moments. The place where everything that is not you dissolves, and what is, remains. After all, one truth remains. You are only truly free when you no longer need to escape your own silence. When boredom ceases to be a threat and becomes a safe territory. A firm ground where you walk without haste, without fear, without distraction. Nietzsche didn't want you to be productive, entertaining, or efficient. He wanted you to be whole. And being whole requires that you recognize yourself, even in moments when nothing is happening. Because what happens inside, when the world stops, is what defines who you really are. Boredom is a rite of passage, a test of maturity of consciousness. Going through it without rushing is like crossing a desert and finding an oasis that was there all along. But only those who don't stray from the path can reach this place. Enduring boredom is breaking free from dependence. It is declaring that your existence is not for sale, that your mind does not need to be occupied all the time to remain your own. And that, in today's world, is a revolutionary act. Because the greatest freedom is not doing what you want. It is not needing anything to remain whole. It is not needing to prove, post, respond, consume. It is just being, even when there is no audience. Nietzsche reminds us that a strong soul is one that has faced boredom, and won. It won not because it disappeared, but because it ceased to be a problem, because it became part of the process, an inevitable stage of the inner journey. Do you want to know if you are free? Take the test. Turn everything off, for an hour. No stimuli, just you. If that seems impossible, you may still be trapped, even with 1,000 options around you. Freedom begins where distraction ends, and distraction ends where boredom becomes bearable. Now ask yourself, could you spend an entire hour just with yourself? If this content resonated with you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you manage to complete the challenge, Write "I did it" in the comments.